For the last couple of years, I worked on feature films with minimal gear and limited resources. I recently wrote and directed a feature film called Above the Knee, which had a crew of only 3 people. In this video, I'll go through the tips and tricks of getting cinematic images with limited resources and with minimal and affordable camera gear. I'm going to go through what type of gear you need, which type of camera and lenses I recommend, and how to get the most out of your location to get the most cinematic images. And in my opinion, with filmmaking gear becoming much more accessible and affordable, I don't think you need a lot of money or gear to get cinematic images that's comparable to higher budget films. And my first tip is, get a cheap full-frame cinema camera with IBIS. So right now, I'm shooting on the Lumix S5. I've shot with this camera for half a year now, and I really love shooting with it. And there are several reasons for this. You can now get the camera used for well under $1,000, and I think the images that you're getting punches well above its price range. First off is full frame, which means it's a pretty big sensor, so you can then easily get a shallow depth of field. Some people might say that shallow depth of field is kind of a crutch, but in my opinion, when you're on a budget, having a shallow depth of field is an easy and cheap way to add depth to your image, and it's a great way to separate your subject. And if you don't have the money for set design, and you don't have lights to add contrast to your image, I think having a shallow depth of field is a great way to kind of hide your budget. Another great thing with the Lumix S5, and it's something you should look for if you're on a budget, is the fact that it shoots in a compressed format. The Lumix S5 shoots in H.264, 4K, 4:2 10-bit, which is quite a compressed format compared to ProRes or RAW, which means you get much smaller file sizes. And the great thing about small file sizes is that if you're on a budget, you're able to shoot more, and you don't have to worry about filling up your hard drive. Because if you don't have a lot of money for filmmaking when starting out, every cost adds up. But even though the file sizes are small, and it's a compressed format, I still think the image holds up very well. I've shot a feature film in RAW, and also shot a feature film in ProRes, and I recently shot a feature film with the Lumix S5 in H.264. And when comparing the images from the Lumix S5 compared to the RAW or the ProRes from other projects, there's obviously a difference, but I'm not sure if there's a big enough difference to justify the cost of shooting in RAW or ProRes. When shooting the feature film with the Lumix S5, we only ended up filling around 2 terabytes of space. But if you compare that to Above the Knee, where we shot in B-RAW, we ended up using 16 terabytes of space. So we ended up saving quite a lot of money on shooting with the Lumix S5. But the most important reason for buying a camera like the Lumix S5 is the IBIS. IBIS means in-body image stabilization. And when shooting with a smaller camera like the Lumix S5, and you're shooting handheld, you oftentimes get these micro jitters where the camera is shaking. And if you buy a budget camera, like the Pocket 6K, what you oftentimes have to do is that you have to rig out the camera and make it heavier to compensate for the micro jitters. However, with the Lumix S5, which has IBIS, which is short for in-body image stabilization, what it does is that it stabilizes the image. This means that when you're shooting handheld, the camera compensates for the micro jitters, and the image becomes much more stable and usable. And the reason why this is important is that if you're on a budget, you might not have the money to rig out the camera. But if the camera has IBIS, you don't have to do that. You can use the camera as is. So that means that you only need a lens, the camera, a battery, and a SD card to make the camera usable, which saves you a lot of money and makes it much easier for you to just go out and shoot. The Lumix S5 also has pretty cheap and small batteries, and they last for many hours. You don't necessarily have to buy the Lumix S5. You can also buy the Lumix S9, and you can also buy the Lumix S1. All these 3 cameras are pretty similar when it comes to features. They all have pretty great IBIS. You can get them for under $1,000. So they're relatively cheap, you don't have to rig them out, and they're very cheap to manage. Tip number 2, get one cheap lens. So now that you got the camera, you now need a lens. And I think when starting out, that you only need one lens. And what should you look for in a lens? First off, I would get a prime lens. I would not get a zoom lens. And the first reason for this is that prime lenses, you can often get a wider aperture while it's still being affordable. This is important for 2 reasons. First off, you probably don't have the money to actually set up your own lights, so you'll need to use practical lights or natural lights. And also shooting with a wider aperture, you're able to get a shallower depth of field, which to me is a great way to get cinematic images when starting out. So if you can find a lens that's around f2 or t2 or even t1.5, that would be great. And also find a lens that has a little bit of character, that doesn't look too clinical. And I would advise you to get a lens that's between 35mm to 50mm. Me personally, I pretty much only own 35mm lenses. And the reason for this is that I feel that the 35mm is the most versatile focal length. You're able to get close-ups, you're able to get wide shots, you're able to get medium shots. It's a relatively neutral focal length. It doesn't distort faces in close-ups, and it doesn't compress the image too much either. I've shot 2 feature films where I only used the 35mm, one of them being Above the Knee. And if we were to recommend one specific lens, it would be the TT Artisan 40mm f2. This lens only costs $168 US. It's not a 35mm lens, but it's pretty close. It's full frame, and it has a little bit of a vintage characteristic, but it's still clean enough where you can use it for pretty much any project. It's also very small, so you can just bring it with you anywhere, and it opens up to f2, which means you can get a shallow depth of field. And what's surprising about this lens is that even at wide open, everything that's in focus is pretty sharp, and there's not much chromatic aberration. There's some vignetting, but I feel like that's part of the look. So I use this lens quite a lot, and I really like it. And if you want to buy it, feel free to use my affiliate link. And the great thing of only having one lens is that if you want to change the framing, you have to physically move the camera, which to me leads to a more dynamic and cinematic shooting style. And also only having one lens saves you a lot of money. Tip number 3, make the most out of available light. So if you have a limited budget and don't have a lot of money to spend on gear, and maybe you're a beginner filmmaker, I would not waste time or money on setting up lights yourself. I would advise you to use natural light or practical light. One great way of doing this is using windows. If you put your subject right next to a window and you make sure to diffuse it with curtains, and you put the camera shadow side, that's a great and easy way to get cinematic images. Me personally, for pretty much my whole career, I've nearly only used available light. For example, my feature film Good Boy was only shot with available light. So when we shot during the day, we made sure we had locations with a lot of windows, and then when shooting at night, we made sure that all locations had a lot of lamps that we could use. And then for the night scenes, we just put the actors close to the lamps. And same as we did with the windows, we made sure to shoot shadow side. And the newest feature film that I shot, with the Lumix S5, we shot pretty much everything outside in the woods. And shooting outside in the woods is one of the best ways to get cinematic images. You get a lot of natural light, and with the trees and the nature, you get a very interesting background. And then when shooting outside, it's best to shoot when it's overcast, because then you get a soft image. And if you look at my YouTube channel, everything that I've shot has been done with available lights. All of my talking heads has been done with natural light. I put the camera in a room with a lot of big windows. And then actually for this shot, if I zoom back, you can see that I don't actually have a film light. I'm just using a normal lamp that was in the house. Then I just put a bed sheet over the lamp to get a softer image. Also, using available light also saves time and energy because you don't have to bring a lot of equipment. And if you're shooting alone, it's much easier to shoot this way. And also when starting out, it's a great way to really learn what type of lighting looks good and cinematic. So that when you get to the point where you're actually setting up film lights, you know what you like and you know what you want to replicate. I will now also give you some general tips on how to get cinematic images. Try to create as much depth as possible by shooting as far away from walls as possible. For example, as you can see with this setup, I set myself and the camera in the middle of the room. And as you can see, you get a relatively cinematic image, you get a blurry background, and you get the image that looks pleasing. And to get this depth, you should try to shoot in big spaces. And examples of those are forests, or big cities, or just big landscapes in general. Just shooting in a big environment is a simple and easy hack to get cinematic images. And a great thing about using a small camera that you don't have to rig out, like the Lumix S5, is that you're able to bring it anywhere. So if a bigger production were to shoot in the city, for example, they would need permits to actually shoot. But since you're using a smaller camera, where you look more like a hobbyist, taking photographs, you're able to shoot in much more exotic locations, without having to ask for permission or to pay for permits. Also when shooting, I think you should get close to the subject. I like to get up close, and I like to shoot right in front of my subject. And I either want my actor to look into the camera, if I'm doing a test video, or more of a camera test. But if I'm shooting something narrative, I want my eye line to be as close to the lens as possible. So oftentimes, I tell my actors to look right next to the lens. And I think with this, you get very intimate and very cinematic images, where you're up close to the actor, and it just feels very personal. In my opinion, you feel more drawn into the character as an audience member. And my last tip is just go crazy and experiment. I think with all the tips that I've given in this video, it's a great start to get cinematic images, but I would also advise you to test out different things. For example, try out wider lenses, or maybe longer lenses. Try to get some really unorthodox compositions, and just in general, experiment. Try out how it feels to shoot handheld, and then maybe try out the gimbal, or try shooting on a tripod, and really find out what type of shooting style you like the best. So those were some of my tips on how to get cinematic images on a budget. In short, you should get a cheap, full-frame camera that has IBIS. For example, the Lumix S5 that I'm using right now. You should get one cheap lens that can shoot at a wide aperture to get shallow depth of field. Try and use available light. Shoot in big and nice locations where you can create a lot of depth. That's my video on how to get cinematic images on a budget. Hope you guys learned something. Hope you guys enjoyed. And I'll see you guys in the next one.